We have some questions in the audience, so please go ahead.
Okay. First, I'd like to thank Grupo Planeta and the distinguished panelists for being here today. My question centers around the label Latin American, the labels Latin American and Hispanic. I'm a playwright, and I write for a Primary Stages Theater, and one of the best pieces of advice I ever got as a playwright was, be careful if you say you're a Latin playwright, because then you're a Latin playwright. And at first I was really irritated with that advice. I felt like I am a Latin American playwright and blah, blah, blah. But later I thought about challenging myself to transcend the label and what that meant to transcend the label and what it meant if I just owned that I was an American playwright with a Latin American, Louisiana, North Carolina, this entire experience of who I am personally. And so then that was a really exciting challenge, because then I didn't have that label on me, you know, that little cloud, that Latin cloud over me. And I guess my question is, are those labels false? I mean, I go to Argentina, and except for, you know, the fact that we all love Fredo ice cream, I can't figure out like why we have to all be, you know, labeled Latin writers together. Or I go to Colombia, and the experience is completely different. I'm Venezuelan American, and I just think, are we limiting ourselves? Are we doing ourselves a disservice by putting ourselves under this one umbrella, and then people show up with rain machines at our productions or at our readings, and that has nothing to do, I mean, a rain machine has nothing to do with my experience. That's Chile, so, or Brazil, or whatever. So I'm just wondering if we're not limiting ourselves by carrying this mantle of El Gabo or Neruda or all these, you know, and whether we shouldn't just start, you know, saying that we're individuals who write.
Anybody wants to answer that? Pick it up, that ball.
Well, there are some historical aspects, and we have to consider again, and remember that literature, especially novels, were very important in the building of Latin American nationalities and the building of the concept of nations during the 19th century. So the relation between the novel and the countries which were formed after 1810 was very close. And if you read some of the most important intellectuals of that time, for example in Chile, Lastarria, you will see that the ideas, also Bello, who was from Venezuela but who was living in Chile, the ideas of creating a new novel, or in this case, a Chilean novel, was very, very clear, established as a way of depicting and mapping the nation, at the same time building a national conscience, because they were very young countries, without a history, more or less, without narratives, and it was important. It was a kind of homework intellectuals were supposed to do, and that happened. And of course, during the 19th century, that was a very important aim and task for the writers. Later, with the growing of nationalism, this was kept as a very important characteristic. But this has started to change in the last, I would say, 10, 15 years.
I'm sorry, Roberto. I also think that there is another aspect to this young woman question about specifically how in the United States, and it has something to do with what Maria said before, we are like forced to live under labels or to choose between labels. And suddenly it's interesting to know that when the category Hispanic show up in the census for the first time in 2002 in the United States, people were able to pick up different adjectives to that. And you might be Hispanic black, Hispanic white, Hispanic Asian, whatever. In a sense, revealing the arbitrariness of these categories. And I think that maybe one, I don't think there is a, if you have another answer to
I'd
this.
like to add to what you were saying, that you used the word disservice, right? And what would be, or what would be the best way to present yourself? So now, for that, I would like to say two things. One is that before presenting yourself to anyone out there, you know, it's important to see how you perceive yourself. In my case, for instance, it's not a question of, you know, what strategy I use. I consider myself deeply an Argentine writer, whether I live here in Buenos Aires or in Colombia. You know, that's who I am. So I would not be able to kind of change that. Now, the other thing that I wanted to add is that, remember the two examples that I gave, you know, who were examples of being stereotyped, right? Or not understanding. But I also have experiences, which I didn't mention because it didn't come made my point, but I do have experiences with American publishers or editors who are really, you know, I would say, you know, what's the word? Like people who are sophisticated and cultivated and know, you know, what differences there are between a stereotype product and, you know, something that it has literary quality. That's not the rule, though. That's not the rule. So I understand and I sympathize with what you're saying. We are, in general, we are forced to, it's demanded of us that we kind of do something that, for lack of, you know, a better wording, it's, you know, simple. It has a simplicity in terms of form, in terms of content, that it really condemns us to be like intellectual orphans, as if we didn't, you know, really we are able to have a dialogue with Western culture, right? You know, I've heard that's a parenthesis. I've heard in this country that we Latin America do not belong to the Western canon. Say what? You know, I never
once
heard
heard
that
one,
in Argentina.
I once heard one professor at this university, at the class where I was attending to, that Argentina was not a Latin American country.
Well, yeah, exactly.
So it was like placing myself in nobody's land.
Yes.
It's very interesting when you're you know, an immigrant or an expatriate, and you suddenly find yourself in no man's or no woman's land.
Right.
Now, Franco, you also, Jorge, mentioned when you categorize the Latin Americans writers in general, and particularly in this country, you talk about three. I think you mapped the territory without being exclusivist, just as a, you know, taxonomy. And you said, well, we have writers who write in Spanish, who have just come here and write in Spanish, and writers who live here and write in English, and who live this very particular tension about who they are, who I am. I am an American writer writing in English. I owe myself to those big tradition, long, great tradition of English literature, American English literature. And yet I am also a Latin American, a Latino, whatever that means, and with themes and issues. And this is a very complex concoction and very heavy, you know, burden for at the same time, very interesting. I mean, a writer has to work with conflict, so but I want to ask you how much it is known in Latin America, in Colombia in particular, about the situation of these Latino writers. We have people like, you know, a long list, a very great and big corpus of literature written by Latinos in this country, by people of Latin American descent. How much is known about that in Latin America?
Well, little by little they're being known. The curious thing is that you face one of these authors, they speak Spanish, they have a Spanish name, but they are being translated into Spanish. And that's why I raised that question. I mean, should this considered Latin American literature as well? It talks about the roots, but it's not written in Spanish. I don't have the answer. I mean,
I think it's a good question to keep open, right?